The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting a blanket of deep blue across the sky as Dr. Celine Hart sat hunched over her desk. The hum of the lab's fluorescent lights and the quiet beep of a nearby monitor were the only sounds in the sterile space. She was alone. Or, at least, she thought she was. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the small vial in front of her. Inside it, suspended in a viscous fluid, was the strange organism she'd discovered 2 months ago during an expedition to the mountains of Patagonia. What had seemed at first like a unique species of parasitic fungus was far more unsettling in its complexity. A sophisticated organism, capable of manipulating its host's neural pathways with terrifying precision. She had named it Mindula, after the mythical creature that controlled minds. Celine had been fascinated, even obsessed. This discovery was revolutionary, but it had become an ethical nightmare. She had already seen the effects of Mindula on lower animals, rats, birds, and insects, and in each case, the organism had twisted their behavior into something unrecognizable. The host's mind was overridden entirely by the parasite, the creature's desires and goals replacing those of its original consciousness. What worried her more than anything, however, was the fact that it could live in a human host. She hadn't done it yet, not on a human, but she knew the risks. Yet here she was, prepared to push the boundaries of science beyond anything she had done before. The door opened with a quiet hiss, and Celine turned toward it, startled. It was her assistant, Robert. He looked unnerved, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Doc, you sure about this?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and disbelief. "I mean, this is insane." Celine paused, her fingers still curled around the vial. She had seen fear in Robert's eyes before, but not like this. There was something primal about it, something that felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. She couldn't deny it herself. There was a part of her that recoiled from the idea of testing Mindula on a human. But this was what they had worked for, what she had worked for, a step toward true biological control. "I'm sure, Robert," she said, her voice steady. "The data shows it's ready. We can't learn anything unless we move forward." He lingered in the doorway, eyeing the vial she held with suspicion. He had no idea what she'd been through in the last few months, the endless nights studying this parasite, the temptation to understand its power. There had been moments when she too wondered if the price was too high. But that was the nature of science, wasn't it? To risk everything for the chance of something greater. Celine walked over to the sterile chamber on the other side of the lab, the heart of her operation. The chamber was designed to contain anything, from viral outbreaks to alien entities. A human-sized pod sat in the center, encased in glass. Inside, a test subject lay unconscious, strapped to the floor with electrodes hooked up to his scalp. His name was Alex, a volunteer who had come forward when he heard about the project. He was an eager candidate, one who believed in the possibilities of medical advancement, especially in terms of mind control. The mind-bending possibilities of Mindula had been tantalizing. Celine could barely contain her excitement as she prepared the parasite. This was the moment when everything would change. She glanced over at Robert, who stood motionless, his face pale, almost ghostly. "You should get back to the observation room," she said. "I'll need your help during the procedure." He nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, he stared at the test subject, a shiver running through him. "Doc, you're sure this is ethical? I mean, we're talking about altering a person's mind permanently." Celine didn't have an immediate answer. She had been asking herself the same question for days now. She had read all the research, crossed every ethical line in her head 100 times over, but at the end of it all, the truth was clear: this would change the future. Whether that future was bright or dark, she could not yet say. "I'll be fine," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was lying to him or herself. As Celine prepared to inject the parasite into Alex's bloodstream, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The uncertainty, the thrill, the overwhelming sense of breaking through a barrier no one had dared to cross. She felt her pulse quicken as she drew the syringe from the sterile tray. This is history, she thought. A part of her wanted to pull back, to run away from the consequences of what she was about to do, but she was rooted in place. The data was clear. The parasite was ready. With a quick motion, she pressed the needle into Alex's arm and injected the parasite. The syringe clicked as it emptied into his veins, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, Alex's body twitched. His fingers curled into a fist, and his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he stared at Celine, blinking in confusion, but something was wrong. His pupils were dilated, and his gaze had a sharp, predatory edge. "How do you feel?" Celine asked, her voice unusually shaky. She had prepared for this moment, but now that it was happening, it felt surreal. Alex opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he let out a strangled gasp, as if trying to say something, but the words wouldn't form. His body jerked again, and his hands began to writhe against the restraints. "Alex? Can you hear me?" Celine said, stepping forward cautiously. The silence was oppressive, and every second seemed to stretch on for eternity. What had she done? Was it too much? Was Minjula already taking over? Then, slowly, Alex's lips parted, and the words that came from his mouth were not his own. "Get it out of me!" Celine froze. The voice that spoke was unmistakably not Alex's. The tone was guttural, alien, and filled with an intense, desperate urgency. "Please, you don't understand. It's taking control. I don't want to be its puppet." A chill ran down Celine's spine. The parasite wasn't just taking over his mind, it was aware of itself, aware of the horrific power it now possessed. The realization hit her like a freight train. The mind control parasite didn't want to be controlled. It was a creature of pure instinct, and it had no intention of submitting to anyone. The battle for dominance had begun. The frantic thrumming of the lab's machinery seemed distant, drowned out by the sound of Alex's labored breathing. His body twitched violently against the restraints as the parasite inside him writhed. The voice, if it could even be called that, echoed once more, desperate and primal. "I won't be your slave. Let me out. I won't." The words were cut off by another spasmodic jerk of his limbs, as though he was trying to break free, trying to wrestle with the invisible force that had claimed his mind. Celine stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had expected resistance. She had anticipated the fight, but not like this. Not a parasite that could speak, that could think. "Robert!" she shouted, her voice ragged. "Get in here! We need to sedate him, now!" Robert rushed into the room, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He stopped in his tracks, his gaze locked on Alex, who was now arching his back violently, as though trying to break the bonds that held him to the table. His chest heaved with each strained breath, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. What's happening? Is this normal?" Robert's voice was a whisper, laced with disbelief. "No," Celine replied, her voice barely audible. "This isn't normal. It's evolving. We've underestimated it. This is more than a simple parasite. It's self-aware." She moved toward Alex, her mind racing. She had known the risks, had accounted for the possible danger of the organism adapting, but she hadn't expected this level of autonomy. The parasite was no longer a mere parasite, it was a sentient creature, and it was fighting for survival. "I can't inject him with more sedatives. If I do, I'll only make things worse," Celine muttered to herself, her hands trembling as she adjusted the monitoring equipment. The data was flooding in, heart rate skyrocketing, adrenaline levels through the roof, and something else, a strange, fluctuating signal coming from Alex's brain waves. "Wait," she said, her mind clicking into focus. "I can disrupt its control, temporarily." She turned to Robert, whose face was still painted with confusion and fear. "You've read the neural interference protocols, right? The ones we discussed last week?" "Yes, but—" Robert started to protest, his eyes darting to Alex. "Those only work with animals, document. We don't know if they'll work on a human. This is our only shot," she snapped, the words harsher than she intended. She swallowed, pushing down the rising panic. We need to use the transcranial magnetic stimulator. It can scramble neural signals, block the parasite's connection to his brain. Robert hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Alex, whose body was now rigid, eyes wide and frantic. Help me, the voice hissed again. I'm suffocating in here. I can't breathe. A jolt of guilt hit Celine, but she pushed it aside. This was the consequence of pushing boundaries. She had to fix it. Get the machine. Now, she ordered. Robert rushed to the back of the lab, where the bulky machine sat, its metallic frame gleaming under the harsh lights. It was a complicated device, capable of sending targeted electromagnetic pulses into the brain to disrupt or stimulate neural activity. They had used it on rats with remarkable success, blocking signals to faulty regions of the brain. Now they would use it on a human, on Alex, without any idea if it would work. Celine's eyes darted back to the monitor. The parasite was still fighting, still trying to dominate Alex's consciousness. The neural activity in his brain was chaotic, unstable. The parasite was clinging to the last remnants of control. It wasn't giving up without a fight. As Robert prepared the machine, Celine stepped closer to the restrained Alex. His eyes locked onto hers, full of desperation. For a split second, she saw something human in them, a flicker of recognition. Celine, please. It wasn't the parasite. It was Alex. The real Alex, trapped beneath the mental grip of the creature. She felt a pang of sympathy, but she knew this wasn't a simple situation. She couldn't let herself get distracted by guilt. Not now. Robert returned, the machine whirring to life. He set the electrodes in place, glancing nervously at Celine. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice tight. If it works, we might cause permanent damage. If it doesn't, it could make the parasite stronger. I don't have a choice, Celine replied, stepping back. I've done enough damage. We need to neutralize it before it spreads. Or worse, if it takes over completely. She nodded, giving Robert the go-ahead. He hesitated for just a moment, before pressing the button. A pulse of energy surged through the room, the machine humming louder than it ever had before. Alex's body convulsed as the electromagnetic waves pierced his skull, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, Alex screamed. It was a guttural, animalistic sound that shook the very foundation of the lab. The parasite's voice, now mixed with Alex's own, filled the room. You think this will stop me? You think I'll let you control me? The words were raw, almost feral, as if the parasite were trying to tear through Alex's body, trying to break free. But something had shifted. Alex's brain waves were now unstable, erratic, as though the electromagnetic pulse had disrupted the parasite's hold, just enough. Celine could see the change on the monitor. The parasite's neural activity was weakening, fading. For the first time, it seemed like it was losing ground. No, you can't. The voice from Alex's mouth cried out, but it was weaker now. I don't want to be here. Celine's breath caught in her throat. It was working. The parasite was fighting, but it couldn't maintain control. But as the parasite struggled, a new, chilling realization washed over her. It wasn't just trying to free itself, it was trying to escape. Something had changed in the way it behaved. It was afraid. She stepped closer to the monitor, narrowing her eyes as she analyzed the data. The parasite wasn't just a passive entity anymore, it had become something more. It was terrified of being trapped inside a human host, of the very thing that had once been its domain, human consciousness. Please! Alex's voice trembled, his body spasming again. It's too much. The creature that had once been a mind-control parasite was now pleading. For the first time since the experiment began, Celine felt something she hadn't anticipated, compassion. But there was no time for that. She couldn't allow herself to falter. Not now. Not when they were so close. This is only the beginning, she murmured to herself, steeling her resolve. If we don't stop it now, it will never stop. Asked ChatGPT. The lab had become a battleground. The sterile, white walls, once symbols of clinical precision, now seemed like a suffocating cage, an arena for a struggle that was far beyond her understanding. Alex's body shook violently, his mouth contorting into silent screams. The parasite, though weakened, had not surrendered. It was still alive, still fighting, and now it was doing something more dangerous. It was learning. "I will escape." The parasite hissed through Alex's lips, the words slow, deliberate, and full of malice. "You cannot contain me." Celine could feel the weight of those words pressing down on her chest. What had once been a simple scientific experiment, a chance to understand the depths of mind control, had become a terrifying race against time. She had only one option left: to sever the bond between Alex and the parasite completely. But she had no idea if she had the tools to do so. "Robert!" she barked, her voice harsh with panic. "Get the neural disruptor, now!" Robert's hands shook as he fumbled with the controls of the machine, trying to steady his nerves. The once brilliant assistant now appeared lost, his usual calm demeanor replaced by sheer terror. The situation was spiraling out of control. "What if it doesn't work?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but Celine could see the doubt in his eyes. She knew what he was thinking. What if the parasite took over for good? What if this experiment had crossed the point of no return? "It has to work," Celine responded, her words brittle. "There's no other choice. We have to break the connection before it gets stronger. If we don't—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Robert's eyes met hers, filled with understanding. The creature had learned to adapt quickly. It was no longer a simple organism. It was evolving into something far worse. If it gained full control of Alex, there would be no way to stop it. And then the world would know the true danger of Mingula. With trembling hands, Robert slid the neural disruptor into place, a bulky, high-tech helmet designed to send precise electromagnetic pulses into the brain to erase synaptic connections. But this wasn't the routine use they had practiced with animals. They were going to attempt to erase a sentient mind from a human host. Alex's body arched again, his back bowing so violently that Celine could hear the distinct pop of his vertebrae shifting. He was struggling with all his strength, trying to escape the pain. The parasite's voice erupted again, guttural and frantic. "Stop this! You cannot win! I will not be caged!" Celine's hands flew to the controls. "Prepare the stimulator. On my count." Robert's eyes darted from the machine to Alex. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the room temperature seemed to rise with the tension. "Doc, this is insane. If we do this, there's a good chance it'll fry his brain," Robert said, his voice trembling. "We don't even know if we can reverse the damage once it's done." "I know," Celine snapped, her hands flying over the console. "But if we don't, the parasite will take him. And if it takes him, there's nothing we can do. We're already playing with fire here. Just trust me." Robert looked as if he wanted to protest further, but Celine's gaze was fierce. He finally nodded and moved into position. The neural disruptor's hum grew louder, filling the room like an ominous storm cloud. The moment of truth had arrived. "Help me!" Alex's voice came again, this time weaker, more vulnerable. "I can't hold it back." For a brief, fleeting moment, Celine could almost believe that it wasn't just the parasite talking. She could hear the desperation in Alex's voice, the human part of him pleading to be freed. She could see the tiny flicker of his eyes, the fleeting moment of recognition, the part of him that hadn't been entirely overtaken. But the parasite was still there, clinging to his mind, using his vocal cords, twisting his body into something else. "You have no control over me anymore," the parasite hissed, a surge of anger and menace behind its words. "I am more than you ever could be. You cannot stop me." Celine swallowed hard, fighting to maintain her composure. The air felt thick and suffocating now, and her throat ached with the weight of her decision. She had promised herself that she would be unflinching in the face of this experiment, but standing here, on the precipice of losing Alex entirely, the lines between right and wrong blurred. She took a deep breath and activated the neural disruptor. The room exploded with static noise, the electromagnetic pulse sending ripples through the air, and for a moment, everything went dark. The lights flickered and then returned, but the change in the atmosphere was palpable. The very air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the pulse. Alex's body went still, every muscle locked in place. The screaming stopped. The lab became eerily silent. "Is it working?" Robert whispered, his voice shaky. His eyes were fixed on Alex, who now lay motionless, his chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. Celine's hands hovered over the controls, her heart racing as she watched the screen. The data was coming in at a frightening pace. There was a marked drop in neural activity. Alex's brain waves were stabilizing. But Mingela was still there, somewhere beneath the surface. It wasn't gone. "You think this is enough?" The parasite's voice came again, quieter this time, but filled with a deep, simmering anger. "You cannot kill me! You cannot erase me!" The voice was shifting, though weaker, as though it had lost some of its power. Alex's lips trembled, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he opened his eyes. What's happening to me?" His voice was faint, trembling, full of confusion and fear. It was Alex now, not the parasite. I can hear it, inside my head." Celine rushed forward, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that this was the moment, the pivotal moment that could determine whether Alex would survive or whether he would be lost forever. "Alex," she whispered, her voice soft, as though afraid to disturb the fragile silence. "You're not alone. We're going to get you out of this. Hold on." But as she spoke, a flicker of something terrifying appeared on the monitors. The parasite wasn't gone. It had only retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike. "This isn't over," it whispered, its tone chilling and vengeful. "Not by a long shot." A cold shiver ran down Celine's spine. The parasite had just made one thing clear: this fight was far from over. The lab felt colder now, the sterile air pressing in on Celine, suffocating her with the weight of her decisions. The hum of the machines, the quiet beep of Alex's vitals, and the subtle pulse of static from the neural disruptor were the only sounds that filled the room. Despite the sudden silence, there was a tension in the air, a tension that hadn't dissipated, even after everything that had transpired. Alex lay still on the table, his body slack, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The parasite's voice had receded, but Celine knew it hadn't been vanquished completely. There was still something inside him, lurking beneath the surface, biding its time. And in that silence, in that coldness, the questions began to form in her mind once again. What had she done? She had crossed boundaries, perhaps irreparably. The parasite, though weakened, was not gone, and she had no way of knowing whether it would return with more ferocity than before. But the desperate fear in Alex's eyes, the way he had pleaded for release, the tremor in his voice, had been enough to drive her forward. Even if she had been wrong, even if the consequences were disastrous, she had done what she believed was necessary. She had to save him. But at what cost? The door to the observation room clicked open, and Robert stepped in, his face pale and drawn. His hands were still shaking, and he didn't meet Celine's eyes immediately. Instead, his gaze fell on the still form of Alex, and his voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. "Do you think we've really saved him?" Celine swallowed, her throat dry, her heart still pounding in her chest. She walked over to the table, her fingers brushing against the cool metal surface. Alex's vitals were stable now. His brain activity had leveled out. He wasn't twitching anymore, wasn't fighting the restraints. For a moment, it seemed like he was at peace. But peace was fleeting in a place like this. And peace was a fragile thing, easily broken. "I don't know," she said, her voice thick with uncertainty. "I'm not sure if we ever can be. But he's still alive. And he's himself again. I think that counts for something." Robert didn't respond immediately. He simply stood by the door, watching as Celine's fingers lightly traced the edges of the table where Alex lay. His thoughts were clearly elsewhere. Finally, he spoke again, his voice more hesitant than before. "Maybe we've done the right thing. But I can't help but think there's something more we don't understand. Something we missed. Celine didn't argue. She knew he was right. They had only scratched the surface of what Minjula was capable of. The parasite, or whatever it had become, was more than just an organism. It was a force, something ancient, primal, and intelligent. It had evolved too quickly, adapted too swiftly. And if it had done that in a matter of days, what else could it do if given more time? Maybe, she said quietly. Maybe we were the test. Maybe it wasn't just Alex who was the subject. Maybe it was us. Robert shifted uncomfortably but didn't say anything in reply. He had seen what Celine had seen, Alex's struggle, the parasite's increasing resistance, the terrifying moment when it had fought back with the kind of intelligence that had been hard to fathom. There was so much more about Minjula that they hadn't even begun to understand. And that thought hung in the air like a cloud of uncertainty. Celine turned back to the table, staring down at Alex, who still hadn't stirred. He was so still that it almost seemed like the fight had never happened, that they hadn't been caught in the middle of a battle between a human and a mind-controlling parasite. But Celine knew that this was only the calm before the storm. Minjula would not be easily silenced. It had tasted victory once, and it would come back for more. That much was certain. Alex's eyelids fluttered, and for a moment Celine felt her breath catch in her throat. Had the parasite returned? Was it taking him back? But then Alex's eyes opened, slowly, cautiously, and he blinked several times before focusing on Celine. His gaze was clearer now, devoid of the frantic desperation that had marked him before. There was recognition in his eyes, a faint glimmer of the man he had been. "Celine?" he rasped, his voice weak but unmistakably human. She felt her heart constrict in her chest. He was back. Not entirely whole, not yet, but Alex was there. She hadn't lost him. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft, almost too soft, as though she were afraid to speak too loudly, afraid that it might break the fragile peace. "You're going to be fine. We've got you." Alex's lips parted, as if trying to speak, but no words came. He seemed to struggle with the thought, the weight of his experience pressing down on him. She could see it in the furrow of his brow, the way his mouth quivered. What happened to me?" he asked, his voice shaking. It was like I was somewhere else, but not. I was trapped inside myself. I could hear it. It was trying to take me." Celine knelt beside him, reaching for his hand. He flinched at the touch but didn't pull away. Slowly, his fingers relaxed around hers. "It was the parasite," she said quietly. "It tried to take you. But we stopped it. You're safe now. You're free." Alex looked at her, his eyes wide, almost disbelieving, but there was gratitude there too. I don't know how you did it. How you saved me." Celine smiled faintly, though the feeling was hollow. There was no real sense of triumph in the air. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly. "You fought it. And we were here to help you." He nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with confusion. "But I can still feel it. It's still there, isn't it? Inside me." Celine's heart sank. She had known this moment was coming. She had been prepared for it. But nothing had truly prepared her for the words she was about to say. "Yes," she admitted, her voice a low whisper. "It's still there. But it's weakened. And we'll keep fighting it. Together." The lab was silent for a moment, and then Alex nodded, a flicker of something resembling hope crossing his face. But Celine couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. She had been given a reprieve, a brief moment of peace, but peace was fleeting. The Minjula parasite wasn't just a creature, it was a force that had tasted power, and it would come back. She had no doubt about that. They hadn't won yet. But maybe, just maybe, they had one last chance to stop it before it was too late. With that thought, Celine looked at Alex one final time, her fingers tightening around his. There was hope, but there was also something else. A quiet, dangerous uncertainty about what the future might hold. But for now, at least they had survived. And survival was all that mattered. Ask ChatGPT?